You have to give them all the freedoms you can. You can enumerate them, or you just give them freedoms that are common sense, the freedom to move about, the freedom to exercise their body, the freedom to choose where to go, who to hang out with, and the freedom to get away from interactions. Because that's one of the things that happens in a lot of conditions of captivity, and it does not happen nearly as much in the field, that if something's happening and you don't like it, you can move away like we would do.
Right.
But if you're trapped in a little room or a cage, you can't get away from the individuals or the situation that's causing you, pain and suffering, for example. So the word that people use is agency, which means that you give an animal, an individual, as much agency to make the choices they want in the situation in which they find themselves. And there's definitely going to be limitations in a cage.
Right.
Even in a law, sometimes I'll say, well, those elephants are in a cage in a zoo, and they'll go, no, it's an enclosure. But an enclosure is just a fancy name for a bigger cage.
Welcome to the Better Life for Animals podcast, where we amplify the voices of animal advocates, sanctuaries, and changemakers working toward a kinder, more compassionate world. Through powerful stories and expert insights, we shine a light on the efforts to rescue, protect, and advocate for animals. Be sure to subscribe wherever you're watching or listening. Every follower helps us reach more people. And support animal sanctuaries. Enjoy the conversation.
My guest today is Marc Bekoff, a professor emeritus of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Colorado Boulder. Marc has published over 31 books. He has won many awards for his research on animal behavior, animal emotions, compassionate conservation, and animal protection. He works closely with Jane Goodall as co-chair of the ethics committee of the Jane Goodall Institute and is a former Guggenheim Fellow. Marc is known to ask the question, would you do it to your dog? As a simple reminder that the golden rule applies to all animals. In June of 22, Marc was recognized as a hero by the Academy of Dog Trainers. Marc's latest books are Dogs Demystified, an A to Z Guide to All Things Canine, and the second edition, which I have right here, The Emotional Lives of Animals, fabulous read. Leading Scientist Explores Animal Joy, Sorrow, and Empathy, and Why They Matter. And also the Jane Goodall at 90, Celebrating an Astonishing Lifetime of Science, Advocacy, Humanitarianism, Hope, and Peace. He also publishes regularly for Psychology Today. Marc, welcome to the podcast.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, it's an honor.
Thank you.
Speaking of dogs, you were mentioned in the Washington Post yesterday in an article entitled, "This is No Way to Treat Humans' Best Friend."
Right.
Tragic reporting, of course, although with the glimmer of hope at the end. Can you talk about the fallacy of animal welfare protections and how, as you say, it's just a salve for our conscience without enacting any meaningful protection or care for dogs? Tell us what's going on.
Right. So the Washington Post article, I wrote it with my dear friend Jane Goodall. We were pleasantly surprised that they would publish, a guest opinion, an op-ed like that. But your question is a good one, because in so many situations, animal welfare is simply a Band-Aid for covering up a lot of abuse. There's just no way around it, and the regulations and laws that cover animal welfare in the United States and elsewhere they're just very weak. In other words, if you're trying as hard as you can, say, not to cause a dog or other animal, an earthworm, any animal, if you're trying as hard as you can not to have them suffer, but some suffering occurs, then that's okay, because you're doing the best you can. And oftentimes the science of animal welfare is based on we call a utilitarian calculus, which means if the gains for humans are more than the suffering for dogs, then that's okay. I mean, so in a book that I wrote with Jessica Pierce called The Animal's Agenda, we argued against the science of animal welfare and argued for what we call the science of animal well-being, in which the life of every single individual matters, and that every life has intrinsic or inherent value, which means that we don't have any right to intrude and, if you will, reduce the quality of life in a painful way for any individual.
I think at the end of the article, they talk about, you might have mentioned that with everything being put on hold with our government right now, that this might be an opportunity to get some of those dogs out of there.
Yeah, you can only hope. I mean, it's a lucrative business, I mean, it's a business in which the bartering individuals are dogs, who are being bred and raised to go off to research labs. And yeah, I mean, one side effect of changes in the economy and the availability of money for certain sorts of research might simply be that there's not enough money to do this research, and you can only hope these dogs will be put in um, wonderful forever homes.
Right.
But the reality of the situation is there's no guarantee. I mean, and I should say, and especially working with Jane Goodall, I'm really an optimist. I mean, I'm really a hopeful monster, if you will. But sometimes it's hard to keep the hope up. But these dog breeding facilities are really horrific, and th they're as good a place as any to start because most people, maybe not all, who choose to live with a dog have that dog's well-being and quality of life in their hearts.
So that makes them what you call a gateway animal, in hopes that if you can feel something for your dog, why can't that transfer to a pig or a cow or even a fish?
Right. I call dogs, like a gateway species for bridging the empathy gap. Exactly. And it works. I always say, well, I'm going to bring it home. How many people here live with a dog and or a cat or any companion animal? Some audiences, every hand goes up, but it's usually the majority of people. And you go, you think, would you do to your dog what is done to other animals or what you allow them to do to other animals? Because if you don't speak out against the abuse, in my opinion, you're for it. And,
Right.
and I know
You're
people
culpable.
are, yeah, you are. And people will argue against that. And I've heard some interesting arguments, but the time's really come if you don't like something that's happening to other animals, speak your voice. And I always say, speak it politely, nicely.
Hmm.
I'm really not into this aggressiveness because it doesn't do anything. I mean, you can be politely assertive, and that's what I really favor. Because when you get in someone's face, you're done. The minute someone
Hmm.
goes on the defensive, you might as well just go home.
It seems that people find it so hard to make a change, when somebody, like right now, I've been hearing a lot about, meat is good again,
Mhm.
it's easy when animals are viewed as objects, I guess. And I love how you say, who's for dinner instead of what's for dinner. How does recognizing animals as sentient beings in our language challenge the traditional views of animal welfare?
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit that some of these things have come up years ago when I would be running or hiking with my dog or dogs. And the who's for dinner came up because, um, you know, so many farm animals or food animals are sentient beings. They have feelings. They're a who, they're not a what or that or an it or a
Right.
which. Um, and it just came to me. And when I started using it, people did not quite grasp what I was saying and why, and that opens the door to say, well, they're a who, their life matters to them, it should matter to us, and they're not an object. You don't call your couch or a chair or a car a who. It could be a that or a which, or I guess you could call it an it. But for living sentient beings and non-sentient beings, by the way, um, using who really is somewhat of a conversation stopper and starter because people will say, well, why did you say who's for dinner? And then you could nicely go into a discussion that these animals have feelings. And even if they don't have feelings, their life matters to them. Across the animal kingdom, you'll see the evolution of a lot of anti-predatory behaviors and other behaviors that protect that individual from pain and suffering and harm.
Mm.
And they evolve for a reason.
Yeah.
You're listening to Better Life for Animals podcast. Our mission is to amplify the voices of animal advocates, sanctuaries, and changemakers working toward a kinder, more compassionate world. But we can't do it alone. We need your help. First of all, go ahead and subscribe to this channel wherever you're watching or listening. And then get involved by visiting betterlifeforanimals.com. That's betterlifeforanimals.com. Be sure to check out our blog, learn more about incredible sanctuaries, and explore our book section, where 100% of net proceeds from book sales are donated to sanctuaries. Every action you take helps to make a difference. And remember, subscribe to this channel. And now, back to the show.
Your recent writings have expanded the 5 freedoms to 10. I see things like this and know animals trapped in factories and labs aren't receiving any of these considerations. And like you, I've seen elephants, both in their natural habitat as well as trapped inside of a zoo, just as an example. And that's why I believe it's so important to support animal sanctuaries. Can you talk a little bit about the reforms you'd like to see whenever we take animals into our keeping?
Yeah, I mean, you have to give them all the freedoms you can. You can enumerate them, or you just give them freedoms that are common sense, the freedom to move about, the freedom to exercise their body, the freedom to choose where to go, who to hang out with, and the freedom to get away from interactions. Because that's one of the things that happens in a lot of conditions of captivity. And it does not happen nearly as much in the field, that if something's happening and you don't like it, you can move away like we would do.
Right.
But if you're trapped in a little room or a cage, you can't get away from the individuals or the situation that's causing you, pain and suffering, for example. So the word that people use is agency, which means that you give an animal, an individual, as much agency to make the choices they want in the situation in which they find themselves. And there's definitely going to be limitations in a cage.
Right.
Even in a law, sometimes I'll say, well, those elephants are in a cage in a zoo, and they'll go, no, it's an enclosure. But an enclosure is just a fancy name for a bigger cage. And most enclosures don't come close to giving the animals the freedom to move around that they would have in the wild, or even a fraction of it. I mean, I understand you're not going to give an elephant or a lion or a wolf, thousands of acres in which to roam, but you're not even giving them the opportunity to choose to go where they want to do, to get either away from something or to interact with another particular individual. So giving them.
And we see that in our domestic animals. I know I have a dog who likes to be in the office alone for long periods of the day. And that's a freedom that she needs. She needs in order to feel safe. So I think we get it in our pets. Why wouldn't we get that? I mean, it's true of ourselves.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, because I do a lot of work on dogs, and a lot of homed dogs, they're captive individuals. And I don't mean that in a negative way. Jessica Pearson and I wrote a book called Unleashing Your Dog. And we started out with the premise that a lot of these dogs are captive. We tell them when they could eat, what they can eat, where they could eat, when they can pee and poop, where they can pee and poop, when they can play, with whom they can play, etc. And so I'm not being 100% critical. I know some home dogs that have very good lives.
Sure.
But when you start thinking of a homed dog as a captive individual, it it just opens the door for a lot of discussion about what do you mean? You know what I mean? Like what do you mean captive? Well, depending where you live, they can't go out on their own.
No,
There's cars or I mean, there's danger out there for them. So a responsible dog guardian will definitely keep the dog constrained. So if you are keeping the dog in a small area with very limited freedom of movement or freedom of choice, you've got to even bend over more to get them out so they can exercise their agency. And another word that comes up is consent.
mm,
That, we should try as hard as we can to offer offer dogs, but other animals, wild animals too, of course, the ability to consent to something. And sometimes people giggle and they laugh at that, only humans can consent. Well, that's not true. I mean,
no,
if you're trying to get a dog or another animal in the wild to do something and they're running away or they're fighting you because they don't want to do it,
that's
it's
right.
obviously that they are a non-consenting individual.
Right. Anyone who has a pet knows what they are, how they say no.
Yeah, exactly. They're
Yeah,
saying they're
yeah,
saying no, thank you.
that's right.
Let's try something else.
Right.
Right.
Tell us a bit about wolves and how some of these re-entry programs are impacting their well-being.
Yeah, well, in the my home state of Colorado, 10 wolves were released. They were captured in Oregon and released in December 2023. And then just about 2 months ago, 15 wolves were wolf napped or kidnapped in British Columbia and brought to Colorado. So the whole process of the reintroduction or repatriation is a very intensely stressful time for each individual wolf.
Mm.
You're you're capturing them, you're knocking them out to do a health test, check. Then you're flying them somewhere and you're basically putting them out in a strange land, strange environs um, where they've never been. And you're breaking up their home pack, and then you're releasing them either as individuals or, as pairs, whatever you think is best, in a strange area. So um, I wrote an article called The Slippery Slopes of Reintroduction Programs because these are questions that you really need to ask. So, what's happened in, say, Oregon or British Columbia when you bring wolves to Colorado or you bring them elsewhere? You've broken up packs or groups of animals. So I remember probably 20 or so years ago at a meeting, I really naively asked, well, what happened to the packs in the areas from which you basically stole the wolves? And no one knew. And it got really quiet. And I said, I'm a scientist, so I'm asking what happened, not because I want to be criticizing you and get on you. It would be interesting to know. And it's the same kind of question of what happens when these animals are released in their new homes. Do they meet one another? Do they meet other resident animals? So in this case, the 15 wolves who came down from British Columbia might run into some of the 10 who came from Oregon a year earlier. What about the prey species?
Mm.
The elk, the deer, the moose. They were not subjected to wolves before. So there are questions about welfare or well-being there. But, a lot of times people just snicker and say, well, we can't control everything. Or, well, basically they'll say, well, these prey animals, these ungulates evolved to be food. Well, in some ways they did, but that's hardly a good reason for us to interfere in their lives and increase the likelihood that they will be killed by a new predator, in addition to the predators who are already on the ground in Colorado.
I heard you on a podcast with an individual who was focusing on the orca whales.
Hmm.
And I found it interesting how when you focus on an individual animal rather than just the whole population or the species, it helps to reshape our approach and maybe opens a little bit of compassion, but also looks at the environmental sustainability.
Yeah, I mean, traditional conservation focuses on what they call collectives, groups of animals, populations, species, herds, other groups. Compassionate conservation, um, um, on which I've been working for really a long time, focuses on the individual. So the merger is animal well-being, compassionate conservation. The life of every individual matters because they're alive and have intrinsic or inherent value. So, yeah, I mean, if you are of the opinion that it's okay to bring wolves to Colorado or any animals, and it's okay to trade off the life of one or two for the good of their species, that would be permissible under traditional conservation. And traditional conservation can be a pretty bloody affair. I mean, people know that. I'm not saying anything new, especially to practitioners of conservation biology. So once again, when you focus on the individual, it raises all these questions. What right do we have to bring individual wolves from either Oregon or British Columbia to Colorado? But what right do we have to have a dog in a house who runs around indoors, and then when they go out, they have to have a chain or a leash around a collar, some sort of collar and a leash. So it may be more, there may be more freedom of movement and choice, but it's really not a hell of a lot. It's just more than they have when they're running around indoors.
Yeah. You say that your hope in publishing the new edition is to create a paradigm shift in how we treat animals, to fill that gap between all that is said versus how little is actually done. What step can each of us take to fill that dark void?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, the new edition is just not a rewrap of the old edition. I added about 300 new references, added a lot of new material, removed some because the book, publishers say you can only have X amount of words. But what every individual can do, and not necessarily in order of importance, but act locally and think globally. It's great to run off to do work and help animals in distant, beautiful environs or, places where they need help. But there's very few places I know where an individual lives where they can't do something locally and then expand that compassion, expand those actions into more distant locations. So I always say work with your neighbors. They could be captive or wild neighbors. They could be animals at a sanctuary or at a humane society, for example. And just pay attention to what's going on around you. Um, you don't have to found an organization or be wealthy in order to help animals. There's a lot of things you can do. You can help your neighbors and just walk their dogs if someone can't do it because they're infirmed or ill.
Right.
Um,
Good point.
there's very few places I know where they do animal rehabilitation where they won't take free labor. I mean, you know,
Yes,
but
there's always more that needs to be done.
exactly. And right, there's no shortage of places. And I understand that people need to make a living, but it could be a hobby.
Hmm.
Instead of sitting in front of a computer and playing war games, you can go down to your local shelter and shovel poop and help the dogs and cats and other companion animals who are there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's no shortage of there's no shortage of opportunity.
Not at all.
Yeah.
I love how you quote that silence is the enemy of change. That's one of the reasons why I started this podcast.
Okay.
And I really loved this book. I want people to get a copy of their own. And I want to read, if I may, the last paragraph because I just think it's so beautiful.
My pleasure.
Emotions are the gifts of our ancestors. We have them, and so do other animals. Emotions can reconnect us to the world at large and help us truly coexist with other animals. We're all in this journey together, and every single individual matters. When we help other animals, we also help ourselves. By allowing ourselves to emotionally connect with all life, we can make life better for everyone. A win-win for all. We must never forget this.
Oh my
I
goodness,
thought that
who
was
wrote
quite
that?
beautiful. I
Who co
know.
Thank you.
He's a
Yeah,
very famous person.
yeah,
Yes.
right. Yeah, I mean, I really believe that. And on the ground, there's what's called the One Health or One Welfare movement, which really stresses that when we care for other animals, we're also caring for ourselves and our homes and their homes. So I really like that kind of, transdisciplinary, eclectic approach. So you can rest assured that if you're helping animals, you're helping people. If you're helping people, you could be helping other animals. Yeah. I mean, we're all in, I always say we're all in this together. We're just one of the gang, and we might as well accept the fact that, they used to say, well, what happens in Boulder or wherever you live, affects what happens in London or Nairobi. Well, it does. And now with, social media and just mass communication instantaneously, what you think about in your hometown can have a positive or negative effect countless miles away. There's more of a need for being very careful on what you put out there because you can have global effects without even knowing it because somebody's picking up what you said or what you did.
Well, I love how you make your point, but you make it respectfully and kindly. I noticed that in today's conversation. And I agree with you that it just doesn't get us anywhere to get angry about it, not in front of people that we're trying to win over.
Yeah, I haven't memorized them, but in my book, Rewilding Our Hearts, and just recently, it's in the Emotional Lives of Animals. I talk about the 13 P's of rewilding, and
Hmm.
among them are being patient and polite, being proud, you know, being proactive, being persistent, and what, seven or eight more. But yeah, I mean, we all I say every now and again we all become a loose cannon.
Hmm.
And so, the best practice would be never to do it. But it's hard when you're working on issues where individuals are being harmed. It's hard to keep your sanity and your, if you will, your demeanor. But it really works better to do it. And I always say that, pick your battles. And I don't mean battles in a negative way, but pick them and if you know yourself and you know the situation at hand, you can tell when someone's just wasting your time. And
Hmm.
so I really believe that it's perfectly okay to politely disagree and move on. And I know sometimes it's hard, but I think most people, when they've worked on issues for a really long time, can read another person to know when they're sincere and say they want to change and they really want to change, or when they're just wasting your time, because the time you waste with people who are not going to change takes away time and energy and sometimes money from working with people or organizations where there will be change. So I think it's very okay to say politely, you and I disagree. Fine, go do what you
Right.
need to do. I obviously can't change your way. But it's almost a mirror image because there's things on which and I'm sure you are not going to change. So somebody could, just run you into the ground by saying, well, it's really okay if some wolves die for the good of other wolves. It's really okay if we torture a few mice, or in the case of rodents, thousands of rats or mice for the betterment of humans, because other rats and mice do not benefit from that research, by the way.
Right.
So at some point, I think you just gotta say, okay, fine, thank you. Go do what you need to do. I need to work with people who are going to change, and I'm going to be open to change as well. And I think that that's a fair way to go about trying to resolve conflicts and also to bring people together to work on common problems and come up with, say, suitable, compassionate, respectful solutions.
If you're just joining us, our guest is Marc Bekoff, and this is Better Life for Animals. I agree that we need to go for the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
There just aren't enough of us. I
Yeah.
look forward to the day when we can possibly reach that 10% tipping point that I hear about. Do you
Hmm.
have any thoughts on that? Do you think that's going to happen in our lifetime?
I don't know. I mean, yeah, I mean, I would like to get up to 50%.
Well,
I'd like to get 100%, but yeah, I just really believe that you just have to my book Rewilding Our Hearts really spoke to that question of just doing what you feel compassionate about, just doing it. Be focused. Don't let people move you away from your mission. It's hard sometimes, especially when you've got other things you need to do and you've got to earn a living and you've got friends and family. But I think focus is really important and just really believing that you can make a difference, and respecting that everyone can make a difference. So you and I might have common goals of decreasing non-human pain and suffering and death. And you might go about it in your way, and I might go about it in my way. And it doesn't mean that I'm going to be better than you or you're going to be better than me. We're doing what's in our hearts. And Rewilding Our Hearts was really, I wrote it to not only reconnect people to nature, but to say, look, listen to your heart, follow your dreams, follow your heart, and don't let people ridicule you. I mean, it's easy to ridicule people who are working on the well-being of snails, but snails deserve their lives too. So
that's
when you're
right.
working on, charismatic megafauna, I work a lot on carnivores, I work a lot on birds, dogs. It's a lot easier because other people can identify. But once again, when you cash it out, that the life of that snail, the life of that, fish, for example, that alligator, crocodile matters, and it matters to them and their friends and families, then in the best of all possible worlds, people just leave you alone and just say, okay, you work for crocodiles, I'm working for elephants. Fine. And we're all tied together in ecosystems. One of the things that I love about being a scientist is not surprisingly, everything's interconnected, but we're learning even more about those interconnections. So, yeah.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. I'm wondering, is there anything that you would like to say that I maybe left out because you've got such a wealth of knowledge? Anything you want to share, I want to hear.
No, you've really covered the ground. I mean, I think the one thing that I would emphasize too, like I said, you don't have to found an organization. You don't have to save. It would be nice to save every non-human and human, by the way. I like humans. Sometimes, every now and again, I wonder why, but I do like humans. Um, but anything you do is good, as long as it's good for the animals. I mean, and don't let people and never let people say, "Oh, you can't do that." I always say, never say never ever. Just follow your heart and and really commit yourself to it, and don't let others pull you off a track. I mean, of course, is assuming you're doing a lot of work, to increase compassion and respect, dignity, and kindness for non-humans. So just do it.
As they say, never is a very long time.
It's a really long time, but I'm heartened. I just finished a book with a co-author, a young adult teenage book on animal emotions.
Oh,
And in that book, we have examples from third, fourth, fifth graders to high schoolers writing to me, saying that they love animals and they want to make the world a better place for other animals. One was high school gal wrote to me from, I think, yeah, she lived in New York City. She wanted to close down the Bronx Zoo. So people laugh. No, she said, so I wrote back and she said, wow, you're one of the few people who doesn't laugh at me. So why am I going to laugh? Do I think you're going to close down the Bronx Zoo? I don't think you're going to right now, but you're raising awareness, and
absolutely.
another young boy developed an app called Howl. Jane Goodall believe, met him in Florida, and she wrote to me and told me to track him down, and I did. So there you go. There's a team of teenagers outside of San Francisco monitoring camera traps, looking at gray foxes. And just this weekend and this morning, I interviewed this high school sophomore or junior who's just interested in captivity, and she's working for a big organization. So, a lot of times you can just blow those people off. And I think one of the things that motivated me years ago when I was young is my parents just let me do what I wanted to do, and talking to the animals like Dr. Doolittle and saying I want to help them, because a lot of kids don't get that support. So I do a lot of work with Jane Goodall's Roots and Shoots programs, which had groups from youngsters to elders to senior citizens to correctional institutes. But I love working with the kids because that they're uninhibited, and sometimes you wish they would be more so. But and I love when they go, "We want to help animals," But a lot of times people laugh at them. But I think that's changing, Cheryl. I really think that's changing. So look to the kids and encourage the development of what I call the compassion footprint early on.
Beautifully put.
Thank
Well,
you.
it has been such a pleasure to talk with you today, Marc. Where can we all find you?
You can find me at marcbekoff.com. That's my homepage.
That's very simple. I'm sure
I
everybody
will-
can remember
I
that.
may not be there, but you can find me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you once again.
Yeah.
And this is Cheryl Moss with Better Life for Animals.
Thank you for joining us on the Better Life for Animals podcast. Together, we can create a world where all beings are treated with dignity, respect, and care. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're listening. It helps us reach more people and spread awareness about the incredible work happening in animal sanctuaries. You can also share this episode with friends and fellow advocates to keep the conversation going. Until next time, keep speaking up, taking action, and making a difference for the animals.